and disappear, so I'll go and do that now.
Yes, but it's nice to say hello.
Hello and goodbye.
Exactly. Nick, nice to see your face. Nice to see what you look like, Nick.
Hi, Jane. I'll get rid of the video now.
No problem. Hi, Kevin. Hi, Hugh.
Hi, Jane. Hi, everybody. I'll go away now.
Jane, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, I'll mute. Thanks.
Are you in? I'm not sure. It looks like an.
Malcolm, you are, and if you want to hit the mute button on the bottom left of your screen, that would be great.
The mute button, yeah.
Perfect, thanks. I think we'll get started with whoever's in the group so far, and others will just join on, and we'll carry on. Just thank you all for joining us. I know that Roy's excited to be chatting with you. Before we start, just a couple of house rules, which you've already all done a great job at, is just muting yourself. There will be time at the end for questions. So if you do have questions as Roy's talking, just put them in the chat bar. So if you look at the bottom and middle of the screen, there's a little icon that says chat. You can click on that and then just type your question in there, and then Roy will have a chance to answer it later on or during his presentation. So we are grateful to Roy for joining us today. Roy is the head of Bloomberg Beta, an early stage venture firm backed by Bloomberg that invests in startups making work better with a focus on machine intelligence. Roy was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford and obtained his MPhil in economics at Lincoln. Roy, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today about company culture during a crisis.
Great. So I'm going to try to speak for as little time as I can manage. As a New Yorker, speaking quickly is not foreign to me. And I just so we can have as much time for conversation as possible, because I think, as is fitting for a Lincoln group, everybody comes from such different perspectives that it's hard for me to anticipate what's going to be useful. And so the best way for us to have this conversation is for you to tell me what's on your minds. And so a little bit of background on me, just in what's relevant, which is after doing my MPhil, I moved back to New York, which is where I'm from, and 9/11 happened, and I had studied urban economics in my MPhil, and decided that if there was ever a time to go serve the place that you're from, that was it. And so I went to go work in New York City government under then Mayor Bloomberg for 4 years, and that was a period of crisis. And I think that crisis is very different from this one, but there are some ways in which it, I think, rhymes. And since then, I've, without belaboring the whole thing, started a company, ran a division of News Corporation, and now for almost the last 10 years have been an investor in very early startups that try to improve work. And so, I think of myself and our team really as students of how work functions. At a moment like this, whenever the underlying assumptions of the world change, I feel like we can learn so much about ourselves. And I feel a tremendous amount of privilege to even be able to ask myself questions like that at a moment, meaning what can we learn from a crisis, at a moment when so many in the world are fighting for survival, whether physical, literal survival, economic survival. Nonetheless, I think that organizations that manage in this period in a productive way are extremely likely to emerge in a position to really shape things. And so I focus on the very earliest companies. Maybe some of the lessons apply elsewhere, maybe some don't. But so let me spend about 10 minutes with a few observations on how companies forge their cultures in a crisis. And companies could apply to any organization. Again, I mostly have small, new organizations in mind. I'm going to just share my screen. And please, jump in the chat if you have questions. I'm just going to actually move my chat window if you give me 1 second so that I'll be able to see your questions as we talk. But I'll try to leave as much time as possible for us to have Q&A. So first, just to say, what is Bloomberg data? Where does this perspective come from? We are, as Jane mentioned, an early stage venture capital firm. We invest in startups. All of our money comes from Bloomberg, and our focus is anything that makes business work better, because that's where, Bloomberg as a company is really focused as a, Bloomberg's primary business is providing data and services to individuals who trade securities, and so keep the financial markets moving. It's also a media company, as you may know, and so we try to stay in the domain of what's relevant to Bloomberg. I'll just start with my source of inspiration for all learning. Maybe it's a little bit of exaggeration, but maybe not. I teach a 1-unit class once a year at Berkeley about the media business. And I don't know if anybody recognizes this handsome gentleman, but you probably know his work. He is William Goldman. He's the author of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and The Princess Bride, both the book and the screenplay. And he sort of was one of these insiders in Hollywood for a very long time. And the line for which he is best known in describing how Hollywood operates is, he said, nobody knows anything. And I think it's really important to remember that, especially when so many of us come from academic, intellectual backgrounds where we assume that much is and can be known. Not obvious to me that that's true. So again, approaching this from the perspective of being a student, what can we see about how companies create their culture during a crisis? So first of all, culture is one of these wishy-washy words that can mean many different things. I mean, I've listed off here on this page a bunch of different things that, if you ask people, what is your culture of your organization? They'll say it's everything from certain feelings, like how you have joy in the organization. They'll say the sort of, kind of traditional managerial answers, like it's about your values and your mission statement. And then you'll hear lots of other answers. And in a crisis, which is to say in a moment where there is a sharp change in how the world works that may put your organization's very existence, or certainly material aspects of how it operates, at risk, culture has different elements. And I'll just start with what is fixed. So the first thing that's fixed, especially in an early organization, is who started it. And so I've got this, maybe cheeky line about how some companies have cultures completely different from their founder's personality. They don't. This is the founding team of Bloomberg LP, and you can see Mike on the left and his colleagues looking very early 1980s. And, their personalities was that they were no-nonsense traders. They came from the part of Wall Street firms that was not the fancy white shoe part that dined with clients. They came from the part that decided 5 times a day whether to buy something or sell something, and yelled at each other, and were very practical. In fact, on Wall Street, for some of you may know, there's sort of the divide between the cultures where you're allowed to have facial hair and the ones that you're not. So they clearly, as you can see, come from the facial hair group. And that reflects in the personality of Bloomberg as an organization. And I think it's worth asking in a crisis, who is in power? Does that person or does that team have some defining personality elements? And if it's you, a little self-knowledge goes a long way about what are your defining elements of your personality that may be inescapable in how you choose to respond. And then under normal circumstances, arguably for an early organization, a day zero organization, the aspect of culture that I listed out earlier, it's like, what is a compensation system when your company has 3 people? It's kind of meaningless. And so I try to think about, in a normal situation where, early organizations are arguably born in a state of crisis because they are struggling to prove their relevance and to survive. And so they have to, out of necessity, be extremely aware of the crises, of the ways that their assumptions affect what may work, and extremely selective in which tools they choose to use to influence themselves and the world around them. So I'll just say, in a normal day zero culture, which is something like being in a crisis in some ways, the organization's approach matters, meaning the choices you make about how to do things, if there's anything systematic in them. Oh, we always, you know, I mean, I'll give you an example of that one, which is, you know, Amazon was characterized from the very beginning by its frugality. And so their approach was to be extremely penny pinching everywhere they possibly could and try to pass those savings on to the customer. The second thing is that even in the beginning, you have stories. And so to keep going with the Amazon example, one of the stories that Amazon carries is that in the beginning, and maybe it's still true, I'm not sure, every employee that had so little money that they didn't buy desks for employees, they bought doors and attached legs to the doors, and especially the story of how the organization got started. Why did you start it? You know, in the case of Bloomberg, the story was Mike Bloomberg thought computers would be a really good way to share the prices of certain securities, in this case, US government bonds. And instead of everybody calling each other all day long, maybe you could just have a list you would look up on a computer. And he was fired from his then employer and took his severance and sort of said, screw you guys, I'll do it myself. So that's the founding story. It includes being irreverent, maybe a little bit pugnacious, being committed to solving a problem the right way, and those morals of the founding story can then permeate throughout the organization. A third thing is that some of the choices you make are strange in the beginning, because if you only made normal choices, you probably wouldn't be starting an organization. And the choices that deviate from the norm, you know, back to the Amazon example, you know, there's that one, or, you think about an unusual choice like Uber deciding to enter markets where the service that they provided was illegal. That's an unusual thing to do. And those unusual choices can be extremely defining. And then the extension of the personality of the founder or founders is that the first few hires end up driving a tremendous amount of the culture. And it's one of the reasons why I think diversity is so important in early organizations, because you can never go back on who your first few hires were. You know, if they all think in a monolithic way, it's extremely difficult to go back and re-inject alternative perspectives or respect for difference. And so these are the choices in the beginning that really matter. And so just a few practical bits of wisdom that we've collected from the entrepreneurs who we back, some of whom, when we first met them, had tiny, tiny little organizations with maybe 0 employees, and now have hundreds, or I think in one case, even 1,000 people working for them, doing some pretty magnificent things, and everything from international shipping to artificial intelligence for optimizing aircraft flight routes to, you know, we were small investors in Slack, et cetera. So the first one is, in your founding story, one thing you get to control is understanding why it is that you're really, really running this organization. If it is to make money, that's okay. I mean, some people want that. It's just better to own it. If it is because you are frustrated by some problem being broken in the world, that could be good too. But that's the basis of the founding story, and therefore the basis for decisions, especially in a crisis, is when you can't have it all, choosing what I call right versus right choices. You know, when it comes down to doing the right thing versus the customer, for the customer, versus preserving the odds that your business will be alive, you know, those are both good things. Which one are you going to choose? Second is just paying attention, sort of activating your inner anthropologist. What are the choices you make that are really strange? Which are the stories you want to bookmark for later so that you can retell them? And in a crisis, you have endless opportunity for stories and unusual choices, because you have to figure out, okay, nobody buys our stuff anymore. You know, we invested in a company that does live in-person peer support groups for the purpose of personal development at work. Well, guess what? They're not doing that anymore. So what are they going to do? You know, and the choice to decide to offer them in a very different format, albeit a virtual format, of course, an online format, was part of their unusual choice. Third one is that there's a particular dynamic that can come up in crises, which I call the crisis cycle. And that is that getting through a crisis is actually really fun. When you emerge on the other end of either a day of crisis or a month of crisis, or whatever duration and intensity of crisis you have, there is this hero moment of, you know, congratulations and valiance and coming back from the brink. And the problem is that many organizations then start to seek that out. They sort of enjoy the defibrillation of the patient on the ER table so much that they keep the patient from getting healthy and walking out of the room. I was on the board of a nonprofit where every year when we had our annual budget conversation for a 50-year-old organization, they would say, oh, we have no money this year and we're in a desperate situation, but man, we just pulled it off last year. And the first year or two, I kind of listened and thought, oh, wow, that's great that we did that. And then I started thinking, wait a minute, we don't have to do that. And so it's really important to know that the crisis cycle is something that happens out of necessity, not out of desire. And this is not advice because I don't know the specifics of any circumstance any of you may be in, but I will just say that it seems to me from observing others that the crisis cycle is a really bad thing. Acting quickly is essential. You know, how many times have I heard somebody say, well, let's just give it a month and see what happens? And most cases, nothing changes in terms of your level of confidence about something. So better to take action, be wrong, and course correct. I mean, again, assuming those actions are not betting the stake of the entire organization, and correct later. And then there's not just what actions you take, but how much you communicate. I'd just say in a moment of crisis, many employees of an organization, many customers, they just want to see the leader. They want to know that the leader or leaders are still there. And so just being present frequently can matter more than what you say. And I've seen many leaders get in this trap where they say, well, I don't have anything new. It's like, okay, just knowing that today was a normal day for you and you drank your coffee and showed up and nothing fell apart might be worth communicating to the entire organization, where in a normal circumstance, it might not. And then the last one, and I say this as a technology person, is that there is another character beyond the people, and that character is the tool that you choose to use or the tools that you choose to use. And in most organizations, not all, those tools come down to software. You know, if you were running a sport team, then maybe it would come down to the equipment you used on the field. But in most organizations in this day and age, the tools they choose are the software that they use. And that software really drives the culture. I mean, whether you use Zoom or Google Meet right now, actually probably does shape the experience of the organization. And so in crisis, where, especially crisis like this one, where it's of indefinite duration, and so much of our communication, like this very moment, is mediated by software, choosing software with more care than normal is essential. Knowing and communicating your reasons why, and then replacing it. And you know, on our own team, we are experts, quote unquote, in theory, in the future of work. Not that you can really be an expert in the future, but we try to learn about and experiment with work. And so we've probably tried so far, I think 3, maybe even 4, but definitely 3 video conference solutions for our team meetings. And we have an explicit goal to keep trying other ones. Not saying that's for everybody, but there is probably something that is right to choose with intention and perhaps replace with frequency in every organization. There's some nice things about a crisis, and I'll just say this is one of my favorite nice things about a crisis, which is many times the luxury of space to think about these things allows founders of early organizations to do what we call playing house, which is to say they'll spend time deliberating over something like their values statement. It's like you got 3 people. You probably shouldn't have more values statements than you have people, in part because, and by the way, I'm a fan of having values. I'm not trying to dismiss that in general. I'm just trying to dismiss the idea that articulating your company's values at the very beginning is a worthwhile use of time, because I think values are defined in action. And I believe that what you can do is guess at what they might be, notice them, keep a private list, and maybe gradually start to introduce it. But playing house is a waste of time. And then I'll just say for us, you know, at Bloomberg Beta, our culture is centered around the approach that founders are the customers. We serve them. So here you see the members of our team. We're really proud of the team of diverse backgrounds, of people that we've assembled who come from everything from communications to early stage accelerators, you know, engineering, data analysis, entrepreneurship, and our source of support is Bloomberg, which supplies us both with capital and stories and an organization that does care enormously about how we use technology to improve the business world. So I'm happy to talk more about us if people are interested, but I don't want to go too deep into it, but that's sort of the core of our approach, is to treat the founder as our customer. And And so if I just had to summarize and then, open up for questions, if you know why you're doing something, it'll give you the basis for right versus right choices. If you then notice which choices feel unusual and that each one of them expresses some value, there are stories to them, and then you kind of try to get the tempo of the organization up by acting and communicating frequently, with one caveat I didn't mention early, which is never bluff. The founders who in the early moments of this crisis said, I expect we'll be back to work in 4 weeks, back to the office in 4 weeks, or everything's going to be fine. They don't know that. And so being really careful to pay attention to what's authentic that you can know is important. And then deal with things later that you can deal with later. You probably don't need to make your mission statement poster right now. Those are the kind of wisdoms around creating culture in a crisis that I think are valuable, but at the end of it, remember, nobody knows anything. And so that's some of how I think about how organizations create culture in a crisis. I'd love to hear others' stories and questions, because that can create a a substrate for testing much of this, so that, we learn by being wrong, and we always love updating our views, or aspire to love updating our views when we've got things wrong. And would love to hear what you're thinking and what's on your mind. And I think the best way to do this is, we have few enough people that actually think, let's try this. Instead of using the raise hand feature in Zoom, you're welcome to type something into the chat window if you want, or you can just unmute yourself, allow yourself to be seen on video. In fact, if everybody wants to be seen, I think it's great for us to all look at one another and just ask away.
Shall I kick off then?
Great.
Okay, my name is Hugh McIntyre. I'm a doctor. I'm going to ask you an NHSy question, and it's a concept question, because I appreciate what you've talked about is much more small, mobile, flexible, early businesses.
Yeah.
But how do you get a big supertanker to stop looking at its feet?
How do you get a big supertanker to stop looking at its feet? Yeah, say more about, I feel like in a supertanker, there are many feet. And so which feet you mean and how you're thinking about it? Tell me more.
Yeah, the metaphors are mixed. Yeah, no, you talked about the founding message. You talked about the founding message, and in a way, the founding message of the NHS is like a sea anchor. It has become a kind of shibboleth. And so, it's just a concept question to kick things off. You've talked about small businesses, but if I were to lift you out of kind of that to principles, what is it about behavior of individuals that lead teams or are involved in regional or national projects that gets people to see horizons differently in something that's that solid and gelatinous and backward looking? Any kind of key bullet points there to start things off?
Yeah. So look, I've been involved in large organizations, and we're currently funded by one, and none with the complexity of the NHS. And so I think that it's hard. I always struggle to generalize, because I feel that these generalizations so often fail the test of robustness. So I'm really careful about them. That said, I think in any large, there's that Margaret Thatcher line, which I'm sure I'll butcher, about there's no such thing as society, meaning there are only individuals. I think that is, on some level, despite what I said earlier about culture of organizations, that can be true for large organizations too, which is to say, like, what is an organization really? It's this mental construct that we've created in order to give ourselves some rails that facilitate faster movement. And so let's for a second just drop that and say, well, what is the goal that an individual, say you, might have in the context of that organization? And then what are other individuals around you doing that may create obstacles to it? And one way to think, one mental model for the culture of a group of people is that there are some shared shibboleths. I think it's the perfect description of how an organization can be governed. And sometimes people, and then you have these swirling eddies of different groups of people trying to do things differently. And I think it's quite difficult even for the leader of a large organization, to figure out how to meaningfully shape the culture, because so much is already set, so much has already been internalized by individuals, et cetera. And so I think the right way to me to frame the question is less how in general does one get people to stop looking at their feet, and more what are the goals that you as an individual or some other individual has that they wish to change? What are the obstacles to that change, and how do you operate on them? And so just to make it a little bit more practical, let's say there is some long-standing policy that says, well, the NHS only does it this way, and everybody around you does it, and you think it's been counterproductive. Then you get to the techniques of influence, which is how to use stories locally to convince people that there may be another way, get them to observe, hey, I know you say that's the policy, but look at these 3 other instances where that wasn't the case. How do you challenge power? And that, I have I'm both an optimist and a skeptic, in the sense that I believe you can challenge power, but I don't think it happens by asking nicely. I think it happens by identifying the real reasons why people do what they do. And as I'm sure all of you who are in large organizations know, there are many, many people whose primary way of behaving is protect their own job, so that they don't, end up losing face or losing their role, and figuring out how to operate on those people so that they can stop looking at their feet, when actually looking at their feet serves their incentives extremely well, is the challenge. And so, what is it? Is it fear that if they continue doing it, it could get worse, which eventually it often does? Is it appealing to some other source of pride in them? And I think of it as a lock-picking exercise, which is to, now I'm introducing yet another metaphor, but which is to say, there is no general answer to the question of how do you get an organization to modernize. There are only answers in the context of which specific types of modernization does one person or a group of people wish to pursue, what are the obstacles to that, and how do you move forward on it. So that, I don't know, I feel like that's not an extremely helpful answer because there's no pearls of wisdom in there. It's more a method for how to think about it. But if there are specific, changes that you believe your colleagues, the NHS, ought to be contemplating, I'd be extremely curious to hear what those are, because it's all in the details. It's sort of oftentimes founders come to me and they say, I've got this idea for a business, and they'll lay out their concept for the business, and I'll say, well, 8 people had that concept over the course of the last 10 years that I'm aware of, let alone all the ones I don't know about. And you can see them getting deflated sometimes because they believe that there's some conceptual universal magic to their thinking and the situation that they're in. And I sort of say, well, I have a different way of looking at it, which is, imagine you just came to me and said, I think we should really make a romantic comedy film. And it's like I just said, there's 30 other romantic comedies. Does that mean that yours is a bad idea? No, yours could be magnificent, but it turns on the details more than it turns on the generalities, is what I find. And I'm just going to pick up a couple of these questions in the chat, and then happy if others want to jump in and interrupt. And if that answer was unsatisfying, please say so. Kevin's asked, are founders particularly useful in a crisis or a hindrance to problem solving? I think that question is sort of like saying, is the director of a film useful or a hindrance? And the answer, of course, is both. And it just depends on who the founders are, what the situation is. It's a fact of the situation. And so thinking about whether it's good or bad, I think, is less useful than thinking, how do I operate on it? If I'm the founder, that can be one whole set of questions. If I'm not, it's a whole other set of questions. And Shane's asked, I think, a really important question, which is, does the nature of the business shape its culture? Does a car maker think differently from a chain of hotels? Absolutely. And the reason I think that is that the culture of an organization it's not a hermetically sealed place where its broader context in the world is irrelevant. So not only does the industry that you're in shape the culture, because it determines, as all of us know, when you switch jobs, you don't arrive unprogrammed. You arrive with all of your context from everything you've done before. So the nature of the business shapes its culture. the country shapes its culture, the personal backgrounds of the people involved. I mean, basically everything shapes the culture, which is one of the reasons why it requires so much power of observation to detect, okay, well, are we really working? I mean, Hugh, I'll unfairly pick up on the NHS example just because it's such a visible organization. You know, is it really about the NHS, or is it really about the culture of medicine generally in the West? You know, those two things can get, they're different, but they can certainly get conflated with one another. And then Matt's asked, with the recent significant shift to remote working likely to continue, are different skills needed to run a business virtually rather than physically? First of all, there's no question the answer to that is yes, because different skills are required to run a business with an open office plan compared to private offices. You know, one of the other things that shapes culture is physical context. So of course, the skills are going to be different. I mean, I'm hearing people say things like, well, you know, how frequently should I check in with my people? How do I create serendipity? And we just don't know a lot of these answers. And so we're figuring it out as we go. And so assuming that you can just take what's worked for you in the before world and apply it in a crisis is a mistake, because the rules are changing. Now, are all the rules changed? No, of course not. Some of the rules are the same. People still probably like to receive specific positive feedback when they've done a good job on something. But when do they want to receive it? How do they want to receive it? You know, we're figuring all this out. So I think an attitude of not knowing and practicing and observing what the results are of your behavior is probably an even better thing now than normally. The only thing I'd say about the significant shift to remote working likely to continue is I think this is actually an open question. I think there is a myth floating around, particularly in Silicon Valley, that you know, we are in a place of permanent change, that there's been a sea change and now it'll be remote or significantly remote forever. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. We're terrible at predicting these things as human beings. I think what we know is that for now, in information industries, in most places in the West, the culture has become remote. I think we know that that is going to continue for an indefinite period of time. That's not code for long. I literally mean an indefinite period of time. And so therefore we have to judge what actions we take. I think that as human beings, one of the ways we think about life, but also organizations, is we're such simple creatures. We make a prediction, a point prediction about what the world will look like, and then we operate based on that. And if it turns out you've predicted correctly, then you get rewarded because, you know, maybe you sold out of the stock market before the world fell apart or something like that. And I think that's basically just hindsight talking, where we're terrible at predicting. We know this. You know, there's so much evidence that we are terrible at predicting. And so you can decide to try to make a point prediction, hope that you're right. That's one way to do things. My preferred way of thinking about it is challenge whether you know what you think you know, and try to make choices that are robust across a wide range of potential paths, and recognize that your capacity to know is probably limited. So that's sort of more how I think about it, is approaching it from a place of wondering as opposed to a place of knowing. All right, I'm just going to pick up Tom's question. One of the most frequent issues relating to company culture we've heard has been that the companies which didn't believe in remote working and have obliged to shift to almost 100% remote working models. Have these companies undergone true cultural change, and what will be required to render those changes permanent, assuming we believe them to be positive? It's a great question. So first of all, yes, I think for sure there has been real change. And I'll give you an example, which is I have a colleague, in fact, one of the people who shall remain nameless in that photo, not Mike, but in that photo of the Bloomberg founders, who thought remote work was just a joke. And to be fair, in many contexts, for much of time, remote work was a joke. I'm working from home really means I'm running errands and answering the minimum amount of work that I possibly can to convince you that I'm still working. There are cases where that was the case. And now he says, wow, people are really working. In fact, so much so, his word was efficient. He's very focused on how much output people produce. They're so efficient that they're wearing themselves out and maybe should take vacation. So has his mentality shifted? Of course it has. He's been exposed to new data, and credit to him that, many of us tend to use new data to confirm our prior beliefs. Credit to him that he was smart enough to say, you know what, I was wrong. And, are there positive aspects of that? I think anytime we discover ourselves to be wrong, it's probably on balance positive, because it means that our views are more likely to adhere to reality. So I think that part's positive. Does it mean that the company should continue to be remote? I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I can't wait to get back to the office. I want to be out of the house. I want to stop having to watch my words at home about, every meeting that I'm on. I want to see my colleagues again. Do I want to go back to the office the same way I did before? Probably not. I was also getting sick and tired of commuting. And so I think that it has become what was for many years a relatively fixed feature of our working lives for decades, which is to say this work week based, sort of post World War II-ish construction of the 5-day work week, where you had a fixed number of hours and you kind of came in and did some things together, and then enter digital technology. Maybe on off hours, you're still unfortunately doing some stuff. I think that has been thrown into question for the first time. I don't think I would jump to say it's changed, but I would jump to say it is now up for grabs in a way that it wasn't before. And then Hugh, I just want to keep picking up on the point about the challenges consolidating how to scale disruption. I love these questions because, so many organizations have tried something new. They tried remote, and the question is like, oh, wait, we like something about that. How do we keep it from going back? I think this is where inertia is your friend. I have a friend who is a research and clinical doctor in San Francisco, one of the San Francisco-based universities, UCSF. And for years, she's been trying to get the IT department of her hospital to approve signing research grant applications or authorizations to spend money via DocuSign, via digital signature, years. And they've told her it's too dangerous or something, excuse, blah, 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 who knows why. Of course now they do it, because they have no choice. And you know what? I think they've probably discovered it's not that bad. And now inertia is likely to be her friend. And so instead of thinking about from a place of fear of like, oh my gosh, how do we prevent this from backsliding? I instead try to think from a place here of possibility of how do we observe precisely what's been invalidated, appeal to people who will listen to reason, and then otherwise try to use inertia or organizational trickery. And then Kevin says, shouldn't behaviors define how an organization navigates a crisis rather than the tools define the behaviors? Tools should be enablers to doing things smarter, quicker, better, not the logic rationale. So my read of the history of tools is that the tools always shape the behavior, and the behavior shape the tools. It's a system. I remember there's this great line in a book from the philosopher Daniel Dennett, which I think he probably got from Richard Dawkins, to be honest, I can't quite remember, about the relationship between scholars and libraries. And in that case, he's using it as a metaphor for the relationships between organisms and their genes. And he says, on a certain level, you could say, well, the genes are the way the organism propagates itself. And another level, you could say the organism is the way the genes propagate themselves, And so the line is that a scholar is a library's way of making another library. And so I think trying to look at any of these things as one-way flows misses how interlinked they are in the system. Like, yeah, of course we want the tool to serve us. But if you think the invention of the microscope didn't change the behaviors of scientists, of course it shaped the behaviors of scientists. So I don't know, I'm open to challenge about that, but I see it as a two-way system, in fact, a multi-way system between behaviors and cultural values and tools and all that stuff. And I've always wanted to read, maybe there is such a book, but a history of science from the perspective of the tools, I think would be extremely interesting. What advice would I give to Lincoln and Oxford about navigating the current crisis? That's a good one. I don't know that I have good advice because, again, I don't know that I have the right base of knowledge to know what the right thing is to do. I guess I'd just say it starts from a shared understanding of what the goal is in navigating the current crisis. I mean, on a certain level, will Lincoln and Oxford be there for another 1,000 years? Probably. I mean, unless the Earth goes away or something like that. But and so, you know, in a certain sense, maybe nothing is needed to navigate the current crisis because it's a resilient institution. But I think the question to me is what you know, what the nature is of the challenge to be navigated. And so, Matt, if you'd like to say more about that, or if others have other questions, you know, I'm certainly happy to hear them.
Hi there, Roy. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, I guess I was just reading an article today about the universities in the UK, and a lot of students are choosing to delay their desire to go to university next year because of a feeling that a online experience is not as good as a physical experience. But I guess, and that is potentially leading to a financial issue with many universities. So I guess I was just wondering your thoughts on how potentially how you could challenge this view that the virtual education is worse than a real world education. Is there anything that Oxford or Lincoln could do for students to make the current experience different, maybe better than the old experience?
Yeah, I mean, this is a delicious question. The economists call this hysteresis, which is to say, you know, if you imagine you're spinning a plate, which is the current, you know, the pre-COVID activities of the university. You have one of the tricks where you have a stick and a plate spinning on the end of it, and then you stop and the plate falls over. It might still be on the stick, but it falls over. You can't just restart by doing the thing you were doing before, because you need to recreate the kind of kinetic energy of all these pieces that interlinked with each other, which is to say, you know, there were assumptions about the value of learning in a certain way. There was money flowing in, there were costs flowing out, and now you have a whole different system on all of those levels. And so I think that you've started the process to me in a really productive way, which is say, like, okay, maybe the problem here is, you know, the objective function, if you will, is how does a college survive financially while continuing to do as best it can at teaching? Or maybe the answer is, how do you do as best as you can at teaching without putting the existence of the college unduly at risk? Those are two very different formulations of the objective function. And I'm sure there are dozens of other formulations. And so, you know, I'll tell you what I'm seeing with US universities on this, which is that they are pulling every lever at once because it's unclear what the path through will look like, which is to say they are unfortunately reducing costs dramatically because you clearly don't need, in a certain sense, to clean the classrooms as frequently if there's nobody in them. They're trying to do the right thing from a justice and morality perspective for the communities that depend on them, which is to say, just because you don't need the classes cleaned as frequently doesn't mean that the team that cleaned the classes doesn't depend on that for their livelihood. And, you know, you do bear, I think, some moral responsibility for that. They're calling in help from other organizations, namely government. And I think in our society, many problems flow to government as the solver of last resort. And I think that's where we're really going to have enormous problems, because at some point, you know, government is itself just another organization that has financial constraints. And, you know, who is the government for government? It's not really clear. I think we don't have a backstop to the backstop, if you will. And then they're trying to invent the educational experience and asking questions like, should we be charging the same in tuition or not? You know, if you think it's challenging at Lincoln, imagine, you know, the much more expensive to the student and their parents, you know, US experience, and maybe it's different in other places too, even more challenging. And I think what we need in a moment like this is what I call a systemic hypothesis. And what I mean by that is, yes, you can pull all the levers simultaneously, but ultimately that may not look like a solution, because the system of, well, I mean, look, you could stop teaching and stop charging and lay everybody off, and the university in some sense would, quote unquote, continue to exist. But that's not really a solve. That's not really an answer. And because it sort of feels like, well, there's some sense in which the purpose of the university, while it may survive, is not being filled. And so you need a systemic hypothesis. And what I mean by that is, let's assume, make some assumption, not a prediction, but an assumption, and say, let's assume that in August or September, the world looks exactly like it does now. Well, what is a system of offering an educational experience, charging something for it, paying money out? What does it look like? And you're sort of being asked to literally reinvent the institution. And that's where leadership comes in, and conversations among leadership, because there is no right answer. Somebody's just going to have to guess. And the one thing I just say back to my earlier comment about avoiding predictions is, once you've made that guess under a certain set of assumptions, I then think, well, what if the world looks different in the following way? You know, everybody's back, or people are partially back, or it's worse, you know? And if you can think about in those moments, will your systemic hypothesis, how well will it hold up under a wide range of assumptions? Then you've got the soil for a real creative process. Like, well, okay, it would fail under that scenario. When might we know? What should we change? What do we need to decide now? What do we not need to decide now? And the art of, you know, in a crisis, one of the things, the skills of crisis management that isn't about culture per se, or isn't directly about culture, that I often think about is choosing timing of when to make a choice is a real power in an organization and for an individual. And we don't practice that power that much because it oftentimes doesn't matter that much, especially in established organizations. If I decide this on Tuesday and that next Wednesday versus the other way around, it might not make that big a difference. But I remember I worked as one of my projects in New York City government on the bid for the 2012 Olympic Games, which we lost to London. And I think actually the Olympic Committee made a good choice, maybe a good choice for it, but not, I don't know if a good choice for London. That's for somebody who lives in London or the UK to think about. But I remember at the Olympic Games in Athens in 2004, we were trying to plan all of our outreach to members of the International Olympic Committee. And there was this extremely experienced woman who had done a similar thing for the Sydney Olympic bid. And 5 times a day, she'd say, we don't need to decide that until 4 p.m. You know, and what she meant was not we should choose now because we'll get more information, but she meant, here are choices we can make now and need to make now. Let's focus our energy on making those choices. Here are choices where the difference between deciding that choice at 10 a.m. versus 4 p.m. is no advantage at all. So don't just decide for the sake of deciding. And so I think we're in one of those moments now with the calendar-driven schedule of universities. I mean, unlike a business, well, many businesses have called it a Christmas schedule, but unlike many organizations, universities live on this annual and multi-year clock. And, you know, maybe the answer is we should stop living on that clock for a bit, you know, and we should, you know, move to a January to I don't know, I'm just making up ideas, but that's the kind of creative process that I think universities are going to need to be in the middle of. I'm looking for examples of people who are doing it well. I have to admit, most of the universities in the US at least, and I can't speak for Lincoln or for other Oxford colleges because I just don't know it as well, but most of the universities in the US seem to be basically doing the same thing. They're operating on some level out of fear of like, well, if I'm the one who's out of line and I'm wrong, that's worse for me than if I'm in line. And they just don't know what to do. So understandably, they're looking to each other for inspiration. Is that the right answer? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. That's the process we'll have to go through. And, you know, look, I'll say, and, you know, happy to take 1 or 2 more questions after this, but I'll just say, I am in this place personally with our fund where we're asking ourselves, well, how does our behavior change if the world remains as it is now indefinitely? And we don't know. I mean, I think we know that the history suggests that the pace of people starting organizations tends to be relatively fixed across good times and bad, relatively insensitive to conditions in the market, if you will. So that makes us want to just kind of keep going. Default, our null hypothesis is to keep going at a steady pace, if you will. But which businesses can we fund? I mean, I'm not going to fund a business that serves the airline industry right now. And so I think the physics are changed and we're trying to, you know, figure it out. And, you know, my guess is we're going to keep going at the same pace, but changing the businesses we fund until the data suggests to us there's a reason to do things differently. And others are taking different approaches, some out of necessity and some not. Okay. Leslie asked about how to approach changing a culture virtually. I guess I'd just say it depends in what way you want to change it and what kind of organization. And by the way, I'm easy to find. If you want to, thank you, Sally. Sally has to go to a crisis meeting. So yeah, priorities, fitting. I'm on basically any platform you can find on the internet. I'm on the other end. If you reach out and I have no recollection of the context, then it's harder for me to engage. But yeah, you can, find me on Twitter, where I try to share answers to questions that I'm hearing and learn from that. And then I'll just kind of close with Tom's question about what's ultimately more valuable in a crisis, prudence or courage. And the answer is it depends. There isn't a better or worse for all circumstances. I'd love, look, the film buff in me would love to say courage is always more valuable because get your back up and do the thing that needs doing, because it's much more fun to say that. But does that make it right? Not necessarily. I think there are probably cases. I mean, look, if I'm in the White House of the United States and somebody is suggesting injecting disinfectant into veins, then prudence is more valuable than courage. In 1,000 other situations, courage is more valuable than prudence. So the hard part here is we're all looking for what are the reliable principles we can turn to. And I think the only ones I know of are active observation, careful attention to what your goals are, and making the best choices you can make, which will sometimes require courage and sometimes require the courage to be prudent. And, let's just kind of try to support ourselves in keeping our heads screwed on straight. And, my model is then, let's compare notes. And one of the reasons I do sessions like this one is because we can think together about what some of them are. And I promise you, in ways that I'm aware of, in ways that I'm unaware of, the questions you've asked me today will prompt me in some conversation later to think, well, do I really know that? I'm not sure if I know that. And, that's what we're trying to figure out. So I don't know, Jane, if you have any other thoughts before we wrap. But I love these conversations and exchanges, and I appreciate your input, so keep it coming.
Yeah, just want to thank you for being with us for this hour, and keep up the good work.
Yeah, well, I'll try. Same to everybody here. I'm sure you're all carrying your own responsibilities, personal and professional, and, it is a fucking pandemic right now. So if you don't have the headspace to think about how to manage during a crisis, somehow I think the powers that be will be understanding. All right, I'm going to drop, but please reach out anytime, and thank you all for being here.
Great. Thanks, Roy.
Thanks, guys.